Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue reading Kobe Cambone's The African Personality in America. We'll start on page 158, which is chapter 7.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Chapter 7 starts with a quote from Dr. Marimba Ani. We, meaning Africans, must turn our spirituality, our ethos, our Africanness into a political tool. We must harness the energies that lie dormant and diffused throughout Pan-Africa and forge them into a powerful political force for liberation and self-determination. Chapter 7, The African Self-Consciousness Scale and Related Research Findings. It has been effectively argued elsewhere that African-centered research on African personality can be most effectively conducted when the assessment instruments are firmly grounded in explicit Afrocentric theory. In other words, the instrumentation should derive directly from an explicit African-centered theoretical framework. The African Personality Assessment instrument utilized in African self-consciousness research is a direct outgrowth of this model. It is therefore appropriately called the African Self-Consciousness Scale, or the ASC. The ASC scale is a 42-item personality questionnaire conceptually organized around 4 competency dimensions of African self-consciousness and 6 manifest dimensions based on some major categories of African social experience. The 4 competencies, as discussed in Chapter 3, are awareness and recognition of one's collective African identity and heritage. 2, general ideological and activity priorities placed on African survival, liberation, and proactive and affirmative development. 3, specific activity priorities placed on African self-knowledge, African-centered values, rituals, customs, and institutions. 4, a posture of resolute resistance toward anti-African forces and threats to African survival in general. The 6 manifest dimensions cover the areas of education, family, religion, cultural activities, interpersonal relations, and political orientation. The internal validity of the ASC scale has been established through several methods. Initially, this involved computing the correlation between the rankings of 10 ASC characteristics of 25 of the 25 highest and the 25 lowest scoring students on the ASC scale by their instructors. The analysis yielded a coefficient of rho equals 0.48 percentile. Also, correlation between the ASC scale and Robert Williams' Black Personality Questionnaire. Finally, factor analysis of the ASC scale has yielded 3, as opposed to 4, underlying factors. 1, a sense of collective African identity. 2, value for Afrocentric institutions. And 3, value for African survival and defense against anti-African threat. These 3 factors encompass the 4 originally theorized. Test, retest, relatability coefficients covering intervals from 6 weeks up to 9 months occur well within the high 80s to low 90s range. Research conducted with the ASC scale has related to both its internal and external validity, with most of the data falling from within the former rather than the latter category. Momentarily, we will be reviewing several of the major research findings that have been reported on to the ASC scale to date. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. Afrocentric assessment of African personality. The significance of Afrocentric assessment of the African personality is that it is designed within the conceptual framework of the African-centered paradigm. As has been stated, this paradigm assumes that African psychological functioning and behavior, whether occurring in America or elsewhere, are culturally based, deriving from and reflecting the distinct African worldview and social reality. Thus, the African worldview or cultural reality reflects its own values, norms, and standards for defining a normalcy referent to African functioning and behavior independent of European or Euro-American racial cultural oppression of Africans. Afrocentric concepts of African equals Black personality and African-centered personality assessment, then, by their very nature, are firmly grounded in African cultural reality. The African cultural reality defines the normal thrust in African personality system as it influences affirmative African behavior. So it's a good thing to be African in this paradigm. It assumes that you are running the world. The Afrocentric paradigm, therefore, argues very effectively that given the centrality of the operation of the ASC in the behaviors of African people, most of the functionally significant behavioral patterns exhibited by Africans in North America or elsewhere would be expected to be influenced by this dynamic core process. Heuristically speaking, this would suggest that African self-consciousness or some critical aspects of it would be expected to operate as either an independent variable or a moderator variable in analysis of functionally important African behaviors and psychological functioning. Assessment of ASC is thus essential to any substantive, thorough, and meaningful assessment and understanding of African mental health. In the initial response to these expectations, several major concerns have begun to be addressed in African personality research guided by the African-centered paradigm. Chiefly among these are A, the development of African-centered psychological assessment instruments, B, empirical validation of the operation of the African self-consciousness in African behavior and psychological functioning, C, empirical assessment of the effects of racial and cultural oppression on the African personality, and D, the empirical assessment of the role of the ASC in aphasis, Afrocentric behavior, and optimal African mental health. Research findings on self-consciousness. Recent research utilizing the ASC scale has begun to generate a growing base of support for the ASC construct. Studies conducted by me and some of my associates at Florida A&M University and a few other researchers indicated the existence of a relatively strong correlation between high levels of African self-consciousness and positive or effacious psychological functioning and behavior among Africans in North America, particularly college students. In this early research effort, two types of questions have been asked. A, the first type of question asked has been whether or not specific kinds of background factors and conditions, as well as other Afrocentric situational factors, correlate to the African self-consciousness. For example, do certain types of parenting styles and/or early socialization related to African racial cultural identity, educational experiences, incorporating an African history and cultural emphasis, including the African historical cultural linkage in Africa and America, and being in a predominantly Black equals African situation or environments, predict significant variance in the ASC scores. So what type of background do you have? What type of parenting did you experience? And whether or not you had an Afrocentric family. The second type of questions asked were, does African self-consciousness correlate with pro-African self-affirming behavior and activities among Africans in North America? For example, does an ongoing regular diet of African-centered literature, multiple and ongoing acts of positive behavior toward other Africans, such as giving aid to Africans in need, occasional or regular acts of social political advocacy on behalf of African people, perception of attractiveness and acts of mutual support and self-sacrifice for the unit in the male-female relationships, predict significant variance in the ASC scale scores. Implied in this line of inquiry, of course, is the theoretical issue of causality. That is, whether ASC causes culturally affirmative, effacious, or Afrocentric behaviors in African people, as the theory purports. It is also important to note that this line of ASC research has begun to raise questions of whether any reliable psychological profiles can be established for ASC, such as developing psychological profiles for low, moderate, and high ASC levels. Background predictors of ASC. Where the background factors are concerned, several studies have generated findings that certain childhood and environmental experiences account for a relatively substantial amount of variance in African self-consciousness among African college students in North America, as well as non-college populations. Chiefly among these findings have been the following. A, predominantly African elementary school experiences. B, Black equals African studies, studies curricula exposure. C, race-oriented socialization and social experiences with racism, or a history of experiencing racial discrimination. D, a collective communal sense of personal causation. E, feelings of comfort in African settings and African cultural centered environments. F, education level of the mother in particular. G, parental membership in Black organizations. And H, attending a predominantly Black college setting with a strong pro-African atmosphere. So those factors all go into whether or not you have a positive view of your Africanity and your Africanness. In some of the studies that I have conducted, and in the studies that others, for example, a predominantly African elementary school experience, prior exposure to Black equals African studies courses, and African cultural centered activities in high school and college consistently predicted high ASC scores. Cheatham et al.'s recent study corroborated the earlier findings of Black equals African studies course exposure. And they also found higher levels of the mother's education, feelings of comfort in African-centered social settings, childhood exposure to Africans in municipal leadership positions, and personal experiences with racial discrimination to moderately predict African self-consciousness, or ASC. In another study done by Gibson in 1984, a former student examined the relationship between ASC and one's sense of personal causation among African American college students. Gibson administered the ASC scale and a personal causation, or an internality and externality measure based on the African worldview, or the communal African worldview orientation, versus the individualized European worldview orientation, focus of influence, control, or determinism in one's life, to 109 students. The communal external focus of control orientation in this study reflected positive adaptive qualities based on the African worldview. Her results revealed a significant positive correlation between ASC scores and the communal external locus of control orientation. Hence, Gibson found that African students attaining the higher ASC scores tended to be more communally oriented in ascribing influence, determinism, causation in their lives, while students with lower ASC scores tended to be more individualistic in their orientation. Baldwin et al. In 1987 compared the ASC scale scores and background questionnaire responses of two samples of African college students, a population of about 250. Half were attending a predominantly Black equals African university, or PAU, and half were attending a predominantly Euro-American or white university, which is called PEU here, in the same southern city. The study revealed several significant findings. Students from predominantly African universities obtained significantly higher ASC scores than did the students from the predominantly European university. Older students obtained significantly higher ASC scores than younger students. Upper level class students obtained higher ASC scores than did lower class level students. Students having had significant African studies courses obtained higher ASC scores than students without this experience. Students from the predominantly African university with predominantly African elementary school backgrounds obtained significantly higher ASC scores than did students having different experiences from these. Based on these findings, this study concluded, among other things, that perhaps, as the theory suggests, pro-African environments and experiences facilitate ASC development and expressions, therefore healthier psychological functioning in Africans in North America. Naturally, this implication warrants further investigation. Cheatham et al. In 1990, in a 1990 study mentioned earlier, attempted to replicate the Baldwin 1987 study on a northern sample of 211 predominantly African university students and predominantly European university attending African students. Their study examined two specific issues: what differences by gender, childhood experiences, parental characteristics, academic level, and pro-African experiences distinguish African students attending the two types of colleges, and what are the differences in ASC scores by institutional type and regional location? They found the following. 1. Upper level students attained higher ASC scores than lower level students in both institutions. 2. Predominantly European university students attained higher ASC scores than predominantly African university students, and the differences maintained at all grade levels. 3. The number of African studies courses taken, comfort in African social settings, number of programs participated in which serve the needs of the Africans specifically, number of times personally discriminated against, mother's educational level, acquaintance with African elected officials, and fewer positive experiences with whites predicted ASC scores accounting for 33% of the variance. These researchers concluded from their findings that they had confirmed and extended several of Baldwin et al.'s important findings on a comparable northern population. At the same time, however, they challenged those findings where the suggested facilitative role of predominantly African settings and African self-consciousness development and expressions is concerned. Specifically, they argued that since the predominantly European university subjects attained their higher ASC scores than the predominantly African university subjects, which is the opposite of the Baldwin finding in 1987, then perhaps it is the individual's personal and psychological development that determines such outcomes rather than the racial cultural aspects. Alternatively, they speculated that maybe racial cultural emphasis in not the exclusive domain of predominantly African settings and environments, but also occurs among African support systems operating in predominantly European settings as well. So maybe these white schools have an African student union or a Black student union. While these findings and speculations are well taken, it is important to note that each environment probably has its own unique character where African-centered emphasis is concerned, especially under the socio-political conditions of white supremacy domination which characterize American educational environments. Thus, some settings and environments of African people, whether Africans are in the majority or not, may enjoy and or require out of sheer survival necessity based on anti-African activity and balances such as in predominantly white environments, more African centered emphasis and support systems, overtly speaking, than others, and thereby having more pronounced impact on ASC expression and encouraging and reinforcing it. So maybe that Black Student Union does Black students some good in predominantly white environments. Additionally, we must also recognize the unique and strong African centered emphasis of the FAMU environment, where the Baldwin et al. 1987 predominantly African university data were collected, which is no doubt, unfortunately, more peculiar or rare among predominantly African universities. These factors must be considered in the interpretation of both data sets and in future replications of this research. Certainly, we would all agree that a more rigorous and systematic examination of the African cultural centered aspects of these environments must ultimately be undertaken in order to fully explain such observations across settings and environments. Studies by Bradley in 1983 and Roberts in 1990, also former students, investigated the effects of exposure to African cultural content educational courses on the ASC in two different age groups, high school and college students respectively. In the first study, Bradley administered the ASC scale to a group of 36 African high school students, 14 males and 22 females, attending a predominantly African school before and after they were exposed to a 6-week African studies course and comparable group of students, which was a control group attending the same school who did not receive the African studies exposure. Her results showed no significant differences in the ASC scores between the two groups on the pretest, both scoring at the higher end of the ASC scale. However, she did find significant differences between the groups on the post-test, with the African Studies group attaining higher ASC scores than the control group. Bradley concluded that while the predominantly African school environment no doubt enhanced ASC scores in general, the African Studies course exposure apparently reinforced ASC maintenance and stability in the exposed group of students, and therefore should be added to the school's regular curriculum. The study conducted by Roberts in 1990 involved the administering of the ASC scale along with a background question to 115 African American college students at Florida A&M University, FAMU. 75 females and 40 males. Before and after their exposure to an introductory Black equals African psychology course. The background measure forced on exposure to African studies and the background measure focused on exposure to African studies and cultural experiences, and the before and after ASC measures spanned across a 15-week period. Roberts found a significant difference between the before and after Black equals African psychology course scores, indicating a strong positive influence by the African psychology course on ASC scale scores. The scores on the background questionnaire were divided into high and low exposure groups and compared on their pre and post test ASC scores. Only the pre-test scores showed significant difference, indicating that the high exposure students obtained higher ASC scores than the low exposure group. She concluded that not only did the African psychology course exposure heighten ASC, but it also reduced the pre-test differences between the high and low prior exposure to African studies and cultural experiences. One additional study that I conducted with my associates in 1990 involved the administering of the ASC scale among a background measure and an African centered activities questionnaire to 219 African male and female college students. Where the background factors were concerned, this study found that parental membership in a predominantly African organization, a history of African studies courses, as well as a history of racial discrimination, significantly predicted moderate variance in ASC scores. ASC as a predictor of Afrocentric behavior. While the issue of causality concerning ASC has not been directly examined as of yet in ASC research, the correlational studies that have been done strongly suggest that theoretical predictions of ASC causality may eventually bear fruit in the so-called empirical level of analysis, notwithstanding the fact that more often and perhaps less systematic everyday observations regularly render evidence supportive of the construct's internal and external validity. So, notwithstanding the anecdotal observations that you have. For example, some of the external validity, relatively speaking, oriented ASC studies have found that such behavioral activity factors as reading African centered literature, participating in African cultural activities, giving significant help and assistance to other Africans individually or organizationally, perception of physical attractiveness in African women, a positive communal interdependence approach to heterosexual relationships, and resistance to white supremacy miseducation also predict for moderate to substantial amounts of variance in ASC scores. So, illustrations of these findings occur in studies by Baldwin in 1990 and Cheatham also in 1990, where a higher frequency of engaging in actions specifically to help other Africans predicted moderate levels of variance in ASC scores. Also, a study by Bell in 1990 demonstrated that high-scoring ASC subjects, particularly from elderly and working class groups, tended to make a choice reflecting self-sacrifice and communal responsibility as opposed to an individualistic and self-serving course of action in response to a scenario in which one spouse or mate's experiences a somewhat debilitating life crisis. In some cases, though not consistently, across the various studies cited, these variables have accounted for as much as 55% of the variance in the African Self-Consciousness Scale scores. In the study by Bell in 1990, the ASC was examined in relation to male-female relationships. The ASC scale and an African equals Black heterosexual relationship survey were administered to 177 African males and females, or 88 males and 89 females, representing 4 segments of the community: college students, professionals, elderly, and non-elderly unskilled workers. The African Heterosexual Relationship Survey, or the AHR, consisted of 3 parts: an ideal mate survey, a heterosexual attitude survey, and a behavioral scenario measure. Each part consisted of items weighted together toward the Afrocentric or Eurocentric orientation. They found that high ASC scores were positively related to Afrocentric ideal mate scores. High ASC scores were positively related to Afrocentric heterosexual attitude scores. High ASC scores were positively related to preference for the Afrocentric alternative on the behavioral scenario measure. But low ASC scores and AHR scores were significantly related to non Afrocentric Eurocentric alternative on the behavioral scenario measure. Elderly Africans showed a more significant preference for the Afrocentric alternative on the behavioral scenario measure than did non elderly Africans. And unskilled African workers showed a significant preference for the Afrocentric alternative on the behavioral scenario measure than did African college students and professionals. So we are conservative by nature. That's what all that says. Bell et al. Concluded from their data that the ASC is positively related to an Afrocentric cultural orientation, hence a psychologically healthier orientation in heterosexual relationships among Africans. So it's good for us to be straight. They also concluded that their data suggests that probably the greater social educational distance one has maintained from Eurocentric culture, the more one tends to express Afrocentric cultural values in such relationships. The study of Baldwin et al. In 1990 discussed earlier, involving the administering of the ASC scale along with a background measure and an African-centered activities questionnaire to 219 African male and female college students, also generated suggestive findings in this area. In relation to the African-centered activities measure, the results indicated that such activities as attending African cultural functions, reading books about Africans and African culture, and giving aid and assistance to other Africans during the preceding year predicted variance in ASC scores, albeit minimal. Finally, a recently completed study by Chambers, Baldwin, and Dantzler corroborates an earlier study by Azibo related to ASC predicting Afrocentric social perception patterns. This study administered a set of 3 photographs to a group of African college students attending a predominantly African university in the southern United States, who were either high, moderate, or low ASC scale scorers. The photos were of a white female student and 2 African female students of different skin hues, dark and light complexions, and facial features. The light-skinned African had more European-like features as pre-rated by other students than the dark-skinned African female. When the students were required to associate a number of value-loaded adjectives with the photos, it was found that only the low ASC students saw the white photo was more attractive, whereas the high ASC students saw it as least attractive. More importantly, however, the high ASC students did not differentiate between the African photos, viewing both as equally highly attractive, while the low ASC students saw the dark-skinned female as least attractive. The moderate ASC students did not show a tendency in either direction. Although this research program is ongoing, one very important implication for African personality development and mental health assessment seems to be quite clear. That is, if African self-consciousness can be shown convincingly to be a significantly related to the general domain of positive or optimal African mental health, then the knowledge generated could be used to affect major social policy changes in the African community by Africans for Africans, of course. Specifically, major social policy changes would be required in relation to the absolute essentialness of African-centered approaches to African child rearing and mental health preventative and intervention strategies with high risk or Afrocentrically conceptualized African populations. At this point, however, we believe rather strongly that there are a variety of other developmental, dispositional, and situational factors of a biologically and psychosocial nature that can help to explain the variance in African self-consciousness among African people. Holistically, a view of the biosocial organismistic circumstances of the African personality, especially in the African diaspora, clearly suggests that it is indeed a most complex and encompassing many potential interacting variable networks. Future directions in the ASC scale research. While these findings provide relatively strong support for some of the more important predictions of African self-consciousness theory, the bulk of these data are based on the highly select few college student sample comprising essentially of young African adults. Virtually no direct developmentally related data have been collected, even though some of the important theoretical issues in ASC model clearly point in that direction. Data collection must be extended to substantive numbers of younger or older age groups of Africans to add breadth and depth to the ASC findings. Notwithstanding the fact that this research program is relatively young, it still seems important to expand the subject pool down to the age ranges where it is possible to do so and appropriate to the ASC scale constraints, such as reading level and comprehension ability of different age groups. In fact, we are currently looking at the development of an equivalent ASC measures for age groups as young as preschool African children. Related to this effort, we are planning longitudinal studies which will allow us to observe and examine early developmental aspects of ASC more directly. Certainly, the preponderance of personal and social behavioral difficulties that appear to be plaguing the lives of contemporary African pre-adolescents and adolescents clearly call attention to the critical need to justify this type of expansion of the model. We feel very optimistically that extending the African self-consciousness analysis to younger populations of Africans will help to shed more light on the myriad of personality and socio-environmental factors that may be accounting for the many mental health problems that these populations have. Where older African populations are concerned, this too is an area for future study. In addition, the influence of regular exposure to African-centered ritual and cultural celebration should definitely strengthen ASC and therefore must be studied more systematically where it is possible and appropriate to do so. How these factors interact with ASC and Afrocentric behaviors should and must be investigated. Such future research will no doubt shed some much needed light on the important prediction chain and of complex linkages of biological, psychological, and socio-environmental factors that support ASC and reliable behavioral predictions. We certainly expect that ASC-related research will provide the African community with empirical justification if and wherever such is needed for teaching African-centered consciousness to African children, students, and adults. That is, as our findings continue to demonstrate even more convincingly so, that high or strong ASC predicts high, efficacious, or culturally centered functioning and other positive mental health correlates among Africans, then teaching African cultural consciousness or teaching real African studies, etc., should increase ASC scale scores and therefore increase general African psychological mental health, as we already know to be the cause through our common sense. African studies should and really must be taught to all African people, and ASC research findings should buttress and reinforce the necessity for such a national, international African social policy. Similarly, in the area of mental health assessment, the implications of ASC research findings that are high strong ASC should predict a lower incident of mental health problems or more efficacious stress management than low or weak ASC. The greater the amount of empirical support that we can bring to bear on this prediction, the stronger the justification becomes that African social policy, which advocates cultivating and strengthening of those conditions, experiences, environments, and situations in the African community, must facilitate strong ASC development. These were discussed in Chapter 5. ASC research should also enable us to develop more effective diagnostic assessments of African mental health problems, as we noted in Chapter 6. This kind of impact of ASC research is already being felt by Azibo, studying in 1989. Unfortunately, so long as we, the African community, continue in our victimized condition of cultural oppression, we will no doubt require some amount of justification, ironically for ourselves, in order to convince ourselves and confidently pursue this new direction for African community redevelopment. African self-consciousness related research findings should definitely facilitate these necessary proactive changes in African social policy. So as you can see, he put one question in here where he showed them the picture, but he did not put any of the questions in here. He gave us a guide, but he didn't really tell us what the questions were. And I wonder if he made the questions available. So I may be reaching out to find out whether or not he made those questions available. But higher African self-consciousness leads to better mental health. Higher African self-consciousness leads to better mental health. I put the link in the chat if anyone wants to come up. So as you can see, the mother's educational level, because mothers are usually the first teachers in many of our communities, they are the ones whose educational level and probably Africanness and understanding of the African story matters most, because women pass that down to children. That's that intergenerational wisdom and knowledge transfer that should happen in our families. Men don't necessarily do that because women carry that child, and usually at this time especially, men couldn't get time off work. Men could not get time off work to be with the child. It used to be. They're actually trying to take that right away from you. But women were the only ones that got time off work to heal and be with the baby. The forecast says the mental health aspect is probably the most important part. Oh, Person Kid 21, who is MG2, thank you for tuning in. You know, we have to get to the point where we are wrapping our minds and firmly grounded and rooted in African centeredness in our lives. As MG2, it can't be the chair, it's their chair. It can't be the world, it's their world. Because when you say the is saying that that's the only way, the only one that there is, versus there, which is saying that, oh, that's the one that belongs to them, but there's another paradigm. So you have to shift your paradigm so that you can see the African centered way about these things. You have to stop centering them in your world, because it is your world. It's your planet. You just have to recognize it and own it and act like it, so that you're not in a position where you're so culturally misoriented or looking at the world through white eyes and blackface, wondering why you're stressed out, wondering why you don't have the things that they have. Those are their things. You need to get some things of yourself. The forecast says putting the Black only mentality in them with the courage and self-love and respect to protect it. Absolutely. Absolutely, we have to do that. And we have to do that young and early, and we have to reinforce it. That's what rituals are about. That's what ceremonies are about. What community is about. Oh, I feel so honored. MG2 is here. Greetings, MG2. How are you tonight?
Always good. You know, it's a joy listening to you.
Thank you for coming in. It's a joy and a pleasure and an honor to have you.
Oh my, do appreciate. Yeah, I'm so glad you're covering this. When you brought up the term culturally, and this is something my mom taught me, and we always talk about this. You know, she and I talk about it quite a bit. She taught me years ago, culture is a device mechanism handed down through generations for survival. A lot of times, and especially because of the European frame of reference, we use the term culture and things that aren't necessarily culturally deep. Here's what I mean. A lot of times folks will use the term hip hop culture or this culture or that culture. When my mom, and this is, I mean, when she told me this is brilliant. A device mechanism handed down through generations for survival is not music, at least in the modern day context. It's not clothing. It's not the way we talk. It's not, you know, those are things that are, as Dr. Amos Wilson would say, they're basically indoctrinated into us. It was due to our, for lack of a better term, relationship with these demons and whatnot that have, you know, marginalized, exploited, enslaved, and whatnot. So therefore, we've developed something that might symbolize a form of survival, but it's and we pass it down through generations. But in all reality, it goes a little bit further in terms, again, a device mechanism handed down through generations for survival. It's also for conquering, not just survival, but so you could actually compete. Now, this device mechanism, if you look at culture in its basic form, a spider has culture. Why do I say that? The little spiderlings, when they come out of the egg, they know instantly how to build a web. Now, that's an epigenetic situation through, you know, the genes. It's almost like the culture of a wildebeest. When a wildebeest gives birth, that little, you know, the little fawn or whatever it gives birth to, it doesn't have any smell. But the thing is the moment it gets out, it has to be able to walk and run right away. Otherwise, predators will get it once the smell comes in. That's part of a culture. It's a device mechanism that's handed down through generations of wildebeests and spiders. The thing is what had happened to us, of course, is our culture, you know, because we have such an in-depth culture, especially when I was all over Africa. There's so many things that were taken from us and that we've lost. Those of us that are in diasporas, that it would just blow our minds. The thing is and even on the African continent, there's a lot of culture that's been lost through colonization, by accepting other cultures, because of our altruistic type of, brotherhood of man mentality. We've allowed others to supplant their culture into us, and therefore we lost who we are and what we are. So the thing is, when she says that, it's something that's handed down through generations. Like I said, hip hop is not something we can hand down through generations for survival, but a way of a rite of passage or a way to survive. Here's a good case in point. This is an unfortunate aspect of a culture that we've handed down, and we call it the talk. When the young brother's 13 or 14, and his mom has to take him, or his dad has to take him aside and have the quote unquote talk about how not to be shot by cops. That is for survival. It's an unfortunate aspect. Of course, it's a reactionary aspect of us being, marginalized for 6 centuries, but still yet it's a device mechanism. Same thing is cornrow braids that we were using as maps, in order to free ourselves. The same thing that we would use as brothers in the hood, with the certain the way that we talk in order to evade certain situations. That or like we say, we heard it through the grapevine. These are mechanisms that we had that, of course, it was reaction. It's a reactionary because of what had happened to us in our unfortunate relationship with those who have basically, unfortunately, conquered most of what we have. When I was in the African continent, and I remember when I was in Azania, and I was hanging out with Xhosa and Zulu, and I remember drinking the Mboti, and just hanging out with a lot of the people from Xhosa tribe. And what had happened was they had told me about the whole process, the celebration of drinking Mboti, and all the things we had to go through. And one thing that hit me was you have to pour some of it before you take a drink. You have to pour some on the ground for the ancestors. And so when I was asking my brother from Uganda, I said, well, I know this is happening here in Azania, but do you guys do it 5,000 miles away in Uganda, or several thousand miles away in Uganda? He says, yeah, we do the same thing. Then I asked my brothers over the ones over there in East Africa. They say, yeah, we do the same thing. Then, when I was over in Ghana and certain parts of West Africa, yeah, we do the same thing. Then I looked at Boys in the Hood, and you see Ice Cube pouring the drink on the ground. And that's not anything new. We've been doing that. So that's a part of, again, that culture. And the reason I bring this up is because education, for lack of a better term, and that's what, to kind of tie this together. When you brought up the education, unfortunately, education in a European is an indoctrination in terms of to control everything and conquer and destroy. That's the European, and unfortunately, we've taken on those processes because of the fact, again, reactionary to what we've been indoctrinated with. Whereas in Africa, education is a form of survival to live in harmony with not only those that are around you, but with the planet at large. Same thing with the indigenous folks that were here before. They call them Native Americans or whatever, but it was a way to basically make sure not only are we going to last, but the things we rely on, like the planet, like the birds, the vegetables, the air, that also lasts. Whereas the European doesn't come from that doctrine. We could go back to its inception, even beyond that book, The Iceman, or anything like that. It's just the nature of the species, for lack of a better term. In Central Africa, and I've brought this up before, in Central Africa, when a boy is like 13, 14 years old, he literally has, and I can't remember which tribe it is. I'm sure. I think I'm almost sure it's like northern part of Central Africa. It's been a while since I heard this, and I think it's from Dr. Edwin Nichols. But what the brothers do is they're 13, 14. They got to leave. Okay, they're not hanging around, and they have to go out and they hunt some of the, like the wildebeest or something that's like one of the most dangerous animals out there. And the young brothers will get out there, in their teens. They, it's a rite of passage. They have to hunt it. They get together. They hunt it. They, slice up whatever food, and then the young man brings whatever food he can. He brings it back to his mom's house, and he sits across. He can't enter the house. He has to sit across from the door as he brought the food, and he watches his family and his younger siblings and his mom and dad, and watches the family eat. And he just sits there and watches that, and it's a rite of passage of a way of thanking his parents, even though, like I said, these guys are not even 16, 17 years old. So the thing is what it is, it's a rite of passage to say, look, Mom, you have nurtured me and you've taught me as a child how to survive. Dad, and you've given me everything I need to survive. Dad, you taught me how to go out in this world to survive. And the fact that he could feed his family, where he came from, by proving that he could do that, then now he's ready to make his own family. That is, and of course, we look at that as like, oh my, that's impossible. Of course, because that's the European in us. Unfortunately, like my family, most of us left the house before we were 15, and it was because of economic problems. I had my first apartment. I just turned 15, and I just got my own apartment. Had 2 jobs, the whole 9 yards. My brother left his. He had just turned 14. By the time he was 15, he got his license. He had his apartment at 14. But the thing is in this environment, for lack of a better term, your environment, that's not, that can't happen because, they just don't know how to survive and be at harmony with themselves or nature. But with us, when you talk about education, we've been indoctrinated with, of how to perpetuate the European construct, whereas real education, Matron, is practical application of information. And that's why you see all these individuals that are billionaires in the European world. They usually, if you put their IQs together, including the Musk and everybody else, it would probably be a negative number. The thing is they took information and practically applied it. And therefore they were able to survive and overcome their so-called, they became a so-called wealth status or whatever else. But real education in an African construct is practical application of information, not only for survival, but to go ahead and leave the world better than when you got here. So when you leave this world, you left it better than you got here. No other race is like that. I didn't want to be loquacious, but I just want to kind of put that out there for you.
Oh, no, I appreciate it. And you were not loquacious at all. Everything you said had a meaning, a reason, and a purpose. You are right where you're supposed to be. So thank you. And I absolutely agree. And no, the Europeans actually slow us down when it comes to our learning curve and our growth mechanisms, because they have forbid so many of the things that we would do as ritual to prepare our children for the world. They put us in a position where if we're in their hegemonic world, we can't train our children the way that we need to train our children so that they survive in the real world. Now, there are many things that we can do, like we can teach them to use guns when they're young, instead of waiting until they say, oh no, they need to be 16. They show their children how to use guns when they're young. I don't know why more of us don't show our children how to use guns when they're young. They teach them how to hunt. They teach them how to prepare food for themselves. They teach them their history in the household. We used to do that. We've gotten away from that, but we used to teach our history, not just family history, not just Eurocentric history, but real African history to our children in the household. So there are things that we could do that we don't do because, we leaving it up to them to educate our kids. We've turned over that responsibility to them. And that was one of the worst things we could have done to our children, because why would they give us good education? They didn't give us good religion. They didn't give us good food. Why would they give us good education? They're never going to educate you as to how to be an African man or woman. They're only going to educate you into being a slave.
Exactly. It comes down to like I said, we are very reactionary because of the fact that we had to react to things that had been happening to us for centuries. You have 2 different type of constructs. The European, i.e., and all their ilk, like we include Asian, we include Arab, or anything that's of their epigenetic. They teach, in other words, education for them is how to thrive. For us as African people globally, is how to survive. And that's something, and when you thrive, you're both proactive and reactive. But when you're in a survival mechanism, it's mostly on a reactive. If not, it's all reactive to whatever somebody proactive is doing to you. And that's something that, unfortunately, we've been indoctrinated with, trying to use others as our frame of reference for survival or for education. or to practically apply that information. We've become that became our construct to just react. And you see it. I mean, the advent of their so-called social media is what taught reactionary. It's like we're reacting to something someone else did or someone else says, or a news event or something celebrities have, whereas other folks are very proactive in terms of, I always say that they're not thinking outside the box. They're thinking as if no box exists, whereas we're still in a box trying to think. And a lot of that is why I've been really promoting in terms of the lawlessness of a person's thinking. When it comes to education with these children, it's a way of letting them know that there are no laws that anyone should put on except of the laws that the only laws that they should adhere to are the laws in an African construct is the laws that will make them survive and make this world better for them and those that are of their race. Any other laws or rules or mandates or dictates or doctrines or protocols or whatever else are only there to enslave them. And I get it a lot of time when I listen to a lot of brothers talk about, and it's unfortunate, it's brothers in particular when they're talking about, the government or or the military or what they're going to do or these folks, and I'm like, that's a reactionary thing. It's, well, they're going to do this to us if we do that. No, I don't care. It's what's the old statement? It's better to be forgiven than ask for permission. In other words, it's like I could care less of what someone else does, says, or what whatever their constraints or their corral is. I'm not a part of it. I'm not corralled into their thinking. I'm not corralled into their so-called form of society. I will do whatever it takes to further our best interest and and not just for us to survive, but so that way we can conquer, so we can be on top, so we can make others at the beck and call of what we make them do. So therefore we're not reacting. Everyone's reacting to what we do first. That's the mentality that I think is lost in education, especially with young Black folks, because I think a lot of that is the absence of that masculinity. That goes without saying, because men are vanguards. We just do whatever we do. We don't think before we do many a time, but we're just constantly on the pioneering spirit. And I think that, unfortunately, through centuries and centuries of the disruption of us as a familial unit, their education has made us basically be subservient through the fact that their laws are basically the circumference of what we do, and therefore we'll never break out of that circle until we start to re-educate, for lack of a better term, ourselves.
Absolutely. And once we begin to re-educate ourselves, we'll begin to realize that the box is only there because we keep putting it down over our heads. There is no box. There are no constraints. You can do whatever you want to do. And the only limitation you have is where your mind goes. And your ancestors have given you all the energy that you need in order to overcome this circumstance and any circumstance that they want to throw at you. But you have to, as you said, be more proactive. You have to get to the point. I read an article the other day where they were talking about a young man learned how to build a nuclear bomb just by going to the library and checking out all the right books. So the information is there for us to ascertain and glean from. We just have to go out there and get it. We have to want it, and we have to experiment with it. And instead of being told, oh, no, you shouldn't do that. Oh, ain't nothing in them books. Oh, there's nothing there for you. That's why they put it in books, to hide it from us. And I want to say greetings to Sister Ra and the elders that are listening with her. Thanks for tuning in. But yeah, we have to get to the point where we're not limiting ourselves in the ways in which they have limited us. We limit our own growth and our children's growth and development and potential. We don't know if we've already given birth to the next nuclear genius. We don't know if we've already developed the one that can cure all these diseases. We don't know if we've already given birth to the next Black leader, because we're turning our children over to them from before they're born, to their systems instead of going back to our own indigenous systems. We think that that's backwardness. We think that that's waywardness. We think that there's something wrong with doing things the way that the old folks did it, when that was our way. And that's how we're going to figure our way out of this, by going back, grabbing, and then cultivating and bringing forward those methods that they had, the Sankofa of it all.
Exactly. It's one of the things that I had to teach myself is because most of the stuff that I have that I've been real successful with is self-taught. I might have gotten through the European schools, got my architectural degree, my drafting, my acousticians degrees, and all this other degrees. But the thing is my survival mechanism of the thing, not only that just made me survive within their construct, but also thrive, are the things I taught myself. And that's one thing that I tell, especially these young folks, is don't let anything stop you. Anybody that tells you that you can't do it, that means that you have to. That means that you will. It's like, and don't be afraid to take risks. Now, I'm pretty sure I'm probably twice your age. I'm still taking the kind of risks that I have when I'm 20 because I don't care. Okay. And that's the thing I like to impart on these youth. When I say taking risks, it's not jump off a building like the European does. They take risks because they want to tempt life, because they don't have harmony with life. That's why you see them jumping out of planes and doing parkour off the top of buildings and selfies on the top of tower, because there is no harmony there. It's like, okay, I'll take risks because I want to tempt fate. Well, I don't tempt fate. I appreciate it. When I say take risks, is take risks in creating the impossible. As an African, we've had to take risks from day one because we're the first people on this planet. We're the only, I should say. So the thing is, when I say don't be afraid to take risks, we have the constraints of, well, I got to pay bills, I got to do this, I got to do that. No, you don't got it. That's going to happen. One way or the other, you're going to eat, okay? Because I see folks that have nothing do it all the time. They eat. The thing is it's almost like you can do anything you want as long as you want to do it. And a lot of us, unfortunately, have been re-educated, but with the European education, to say that we can't, because their form of I want to say life, or their form of being, is the only way that we can be. My thing is, no, there's no way on earth. A lot of times I'm told, well, you can't, and I end up making it happen, and and a lot of things. I mean, the most impossible things I make happen. The thing is to impart in our youth. If it weren't for, like, people would not have a fork and a spoon or know how to drink water if it wasn't an African that took risks to know how to do it. They wouldn't know how to use fire if it wasn't an African that said, hey, this makes my meat taste better. My vegetables taste better. So the thing is to impart, because a lot of us have lost our passion for life or our passion for wanting to invent and innovate because of the fact we've been de-educated, I should say, with a re-education of European construct of you can't. Oh no, this won't happen unless it's something that's a frame of reference of Europeans, Asians, and others. My thing, I'm telling you, Matron, I tell these young folks, do whatever everybody tells you can't be done, and don't stop until you get it done, because you will. No one, the folks that tell you can't, that something cannot happen, are the folks that won't make it happen. So they want to make sure you don't do it too. My thing is like, look, I'm unstoppable, and these I like to re-educate by de-educating them from the European who's de-educated us from Africa, and start thinking about being the first African on the planet, the first time you went and saw fire or saw water or saw a place to sleep. You wanted to get it done and you did it.
Absolutely. You wanted to get it done and you did it. And that's what we have to reignite in our youth and in each other. It's like a contagious fire that says, no, you can do anything that you want to do. You can build anything that you want to build. I just heard about some guy that says he has a black version of Amazon. Well, there are 100 black versions of Amazon where they are aggregating stores and sellers of black people and trying to popularize it. There are Black people making cars. There are Black people developing new technologies. There are Black social media sites and forums. They just aren't popularized, and it's difficult to get people to the point where they are going to onboard onto those, instead of saying this is the social media. This is their social media. And when we begin using our social media, and when we can take our audiences to our social media, then we'll be in a better position. When we are able to re-educate ourselves and get to the point where we believe that we can do it, where our faith levels in ourselves and in our own determinate behaviors is built up, then we can get to the point where we can say, no, this is where we're going, and we're going to take our attention, our time, our effort, our money, our ingenuity, our knowledge base to this other place. Then we'll be at a point where we can shift the balance in our favor. Because right now, even now, as I speak to you on YouTube, there are other platforms that are not as popular that I could go to, and that I do go to put out other more adversarial content, you know. And we have to get to the point where we recognize this is one venue. This is not the only venue. This is not the only this is not the only construct that we have for building.
Indeed. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Maxwell Chikumbutso and from Zimbabwe. Of course, there's a lot of folks touting that it's impossible, that the physics won't allow it. He created what is called the MESD, which is, microsonic energy device. And you could go, and even AI would bring this up. Basically, he harnesses energy from radio waves that can power stuff. Now, of course, everybody's been talking about it. It's impossible, even though United Snakes went and bought him, basically paid for him to come to United Snakes and attend their colleges, and basically tried to make him a citizen. The thing is a lot of folks are like, no, it's impossible. It can't be done. No, he's not going to do it, until they get some deviant like Elon Musk to go ahead and buy him out and say, well, look what Elon came up with. The thing is it could be done. Folks say it can't. It can be, because Maxwell, this brother from Zimbabwe, pulled it out. He innovated the idea, and that's the thing I try to again. And it doesn't take a PhD thinking that they're Bill Gates to make it happen. No, this is a brother from Zimbabwe that did not go to Harvard. The only Harvard he went to was that African genetics, that DNA that's within him that goes back 7-8 million years ago. That as long as you think that you could get it done as an African, it'll be done. A lot of us, and I have to tell sisters this, because a lot of us have been so well indoctrinated with the ongoings of European mindset that we've lost I shouldn't say lost. We probably shelved what's real in this world, and that's the thing, that we are the world's chief, number one, and possibly only innovators that could heal anything that's ever been, that could create anything that's never been, and could actually think the things that no one else can think. The thing that happened to us is we've been so colonized into someone else's society, if you want to call it that, even though there's no such thing as a society out of Africa, because you must be social to have a society, and Africans are the only social people in the world. The thing is we've been so indoctrinated that the only things that, again, it's from that survival mechanism, that reactive mechanism, that we think in terms of importance is entertainment, celebrity status. Look at me. I must have value because everyone else is looking at me as value, whether I'm on stage or whether I got 90 followers. But we're not thinking of things that really matter. The things that really matter is, how do you leave this world better by the things you innovate, the things you create, and by living in harmony with the world as you do it. And that's what Maxwell Chikumbutso, that's what Garrett Morgan, that's what Elijah McCoy, that's what it's like. Through our innovations, through the things that we think of, Imhotep, we could go back to the Dogon and Mali, or the Great Zimbabwe Wall. We live in harmony, and our innovations have shown how much we live in harmony with this planet. What happened to us is, now that everybody is so intent upon, I need to be seen, I need to be valued. And like I said, whether it's on the football field, or whether it's on stage, whether it's on a movie set, or whether it's as a so-called influencer, European has taken what's really matters in us, and that's our innovative point. The education we pass down, again, that culture we pass down to generations, from being innovative and living in harmony, They've supplanted that with the only value you have is how you are a more hierarchical status better than those that you've come up with. And the only way we could do that is, well, we'll go ahead and make you an influencer, and we'll make you a football star. And therefore, anything that's there in terms of what you had before as an African is gone. Now you're living as an African only in skin tone, but you're a European in mindset. And it's all about how can you be on a hierarchical basis above and over those that do the same bodily functions and live the same life as you. That no one's more important unless somebody can fly without a plane and teleport. They're not really more important. But that's what the Europeans and their ilk, I always say their ilk, non-Africans do, is they put that in your mind. So therefore, all the things that we can do to be quote unquote superhuman, we've left on the shelf. And hopefully I could tell sisters, as my mom helped me and my dad to a great extent, is to re-educate myself into thinking all of their stuff does not matter. The things that matter is what can I innovate and what can I create? I've worked with so many matrons, so many of what other folks call celebrities. To me, it means nothing. Okay. I mean, for years and years, I was telling somebody this the other day, brother, I was on the bus because, before I lost my eyesight, I was, I toured the world. I told him, I said, man, I've worked with everyone. I've been around so many folks that you probably would be in awe over. Folks are like, how did you know that? And I said, none of that means a thing to me. It doesn't even equate. I don't even care about it. Like I did when coming up, I was like, oh, I can't wait to do this and I can't wait to do that. And I got to get on the Grammys and I got to get an Oscar. And I was like, coming up, that was the European in me. That was the thing that, because it was in a hierarchical thing of like, in order to be important, in order to be valued, you have to be more in our eyes. You have to be looked upon more than those that come up around you. But once I started innovating and creating the impossible, that supplanted anything to where it's like, wait a minute. That's legacy. Those are things that last lifetimes. Not, in 200 years, no one's going to know who Kevin Hart is. But a brother who created energy waves out of, they're going to know this guy. Okay. They're going to know, he's, 200 years from now, they're going to be using a Chikumbutsu to power their whatever cars or whatever they have. So that's the African in us. If we could get back to that through education, or I should say, de-educating from European and re-educating us back to who we are, I think that it's no wonder others try to keep us, quote unquote, keep us down, because if we re-educate into what we really are, they won't last. They won't be alive. I can guarantee that.
I absolutely agree, because once we recognize that they're our enemy and that they're bent on our destruction and that they've destroyed more African minds than we have been able to birth out, then yes, we'll begin to look at them as in the adversarial way that we need to. And yes, things that build legacy are the things that are inherently African. There was a question that I saw right before I came on. Koku put up a question. He said, what does it mean to be African, outside of nationality and ethnicity? And that is what it means to be African, to be the originator of everything, to be the one that can birth out these new inventions and the one that can create something out of nothing, literally, to be the creator, to be able to co-create with the source, because that is where your inspiration comes from. And we have to get to the point where we are back in touch and in tune with harmony in nature, where we can close out all of the noise that the European keeps throwing at us. Like all this, Trump stuff, like it's important, but it's just noise, because he's ruling by executive order, which can be undone by executive order. All of the things that they're doing in the background to impact people's lives and their benefits and all this other stuff, they're just making a lot of noise. They're like bulls in a china shop, not caring about what people would do. Like you said, in order to have a society, you would have to be social, and they're not. The only societies that exist are in Africa. We have to get to the point where we recognize that their worldview is diametrically opposed to our worldview, and that we are the ones that set the tone, that we're the ones that give things meaning, that we're the ones that are the creators and the inventors, that we're the ones that are the birthers of nations, that we're the ones that are the creators of this universe.
Exactly. You know, I try to impart in this, and I'm gonna let you go. I'll be listening. I want to impart on a lot of you young folk, and I have to say thank you, Sister Raw. I'm always, always honored and that's my heart right there, Sister Raw. I do appreciate it. I want to impart on you guys, especially you young folk. Walk this world as if you don't care. And when I say if you don't care, I'm not saying you don't care about things that you should care about. What I'm saying is other folks try to, they know that as long as they can have real estate in our minds, the things in our minds of creating, innovating, competing, conquering, that's not going to be there. So a lot of times, like they'll put like what I call lynching photos are nothing more than postcards. That's real estate in our minds. I'm not saying it's not important. The thing is it's like, how do we keep these folks from being African, doing what Africans doing, and that's controlling the world? We always make sure that we're in their minds, so they have to deal with that and not dealing with the things of conquering this planet. So they can always have us in their minds instead of going ahead and conquering their destiny. So they will have, because once we have us in our minds, you won't be thinking. And I tell these young folk the whole event of the Karen. Oh yeah, look at that. They do that purposely. Because the more we concentrate on someone else because of something that might hit us, our personal ego validation, or then that's 5 seconds of the most important value called time of your life that is taken away because somebody did that to you. Somebody purposely said, I need to go ahead and cut 5 minutes of that person's life short. So I need to put my importance in there. Like you said, the noise that Trump's and all these other idiots are making, I'm having fun with it because I know that's a European being a European. It does not impact me from innovating. It does not impact me from when I'm going out there, I'm working out constantly saying, I got to get my mind, my body right. I got to conquer. It doesn't impact me of the things that my algorithms I've been working on that'll, basically, reshape dang near everything that they've been working on. It doesn't stop that. To me, that's entertainment. Anything that the European does is entertainment to me, even though I have to be on guard because they're vile and their form of entertainment is lynching. So I definitely have to be on guard. But anything that the meanderings of them don't take the importance of my Africanness in terms of my innovation, in terms of the self-respect, the consciousness of who I am and what I want to do. I try to tell these young folks, whatever you do, because that's why those prisons are filled with young brothers, because we've let others, either through their so-called celebrity status or trying to make us be celebrities, killing each other, whatever, we've let another being, we've been infected or we've been possessed, as Dr. Amos Wilson said, by another being in our minds. They possessed them, they got real estate in our souls. And that's something I hope that young folks will not do. They have real estate in our souls when we have to worry about paying bills. They have real estate in our souls when we're like, oh, what's going to happen to our children because we have to educate them here or there. They've got real estate in our souls when all of a sudden you're driving down the street and you're worried because you see those flashing lights. The thing is when you walk this world is I don't care about them. Okay, in terms of, I'm not saying don't be on guard. You always got to be on guard with a demon. What I'm saying is don't let others possess you or have real estate in the things, taking time away from what will make you innovate. Because I'm telling you, all of us Black folks on this channel, I guarantee you, if we get into our right minds, we will be like Maxwell Chikumbutso and create things that everybody said is impossible. I just tell us, just do it. Okay, whatever you guys do, just do it. Don't care about they could all kick rocks. Create the most impossible thing that somebody said cannot be created. And I guarantee you, they will not last much longer. Sister Matron, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and listen offline for you.
Thank you for coming up. I appreciate you. So as you can see, as MG2 always says, create the impossible, because it's only impossible because they say it's impossible. Impossible has I'm possible inside of it. I am possible. So we have to get to the point where we are taking the initiative and taking the reins of what it is that is our creative nature. We can't let these people continue to live rent-free in our heads, worried about what they're going to do in their economy, what they're going to do in their world, what they're going to do in their paradigm. We should be focused on our own paradigm. We need to be on guard against them. So that means that we have to have some self-sufficiency. Are we growing our own vegetables? Do we have enough water? Do we have a water purification system in our homes? Do we have enough guns in our homes? Do we have enough bullets in our homes? Do we have the things that we need to protect ourselves and the knowledge to use those tools that we have in our homes? And then let's create, let's innovate. I appreciate and value each and every one of you that came by. I want to thank MG2 for coming on my panel. I want to say thank you to the Forecast and to Sister Raw and the elders that listen with her. I know that KW Don 7 is listening. I know that APTV is listening. I know that Bwana Haguziki is listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. I know that Oni Tase is listening, and so many others. And you. Yes, even you. I thank you for listening and tuning in tonight. I'll be back tomorrow night. We're going to be reading The Falsification of African Consciousness by Amos Wilson, Part 2. And I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Peace, guys.